In this video, I'm going to introduce the Pingji Cantonese Romanization. So what is Pingji? It's a novel romanized alphabet used to represent Cantonese sounds so that they can be typed and help people learn Cantonese, as well as communicate with each other in a standard way. So this is the full name of Pingji over here for anyone who's interested. So the first question you might have is, wait, aren't there already ways to represent Cantonese? Well, yes, there are two main ways. The first one is Ping, which is more recent and currently more favored academically. And the other is Yale, which is an older romanization, but also fairly common. Now what's inevitably going to happen is someone might bring up this very popular comic from XKCD about standards. Basically the joke is there are a bunch of different standards. Someone creates a new standard, which in this case is me, and then now there's n+1 standards. Well, the problem with using the comic for this situation is one, there are hardly many standards for Cantonese. There's basically only two that I mentioned. And two, very few Cantonese people actually know how to use these romanizations. Unlike Pinyin for Mandarin, it's just not in common usage. And then number three, I think Pingji can make significant improvements on what we already have. So let's take a look at what we already have. Over here, I have a famous poem from Mang Haoran. I'm not going to read the poem yet, we'll go over that later. But I want you to focus on the two different systems that we have currently, Yutping and Yale. Yutping is on the top and then Yale is on the bottom. And you might notice some patterns. So for example, Yutping, it has all these numbers after them. These represent the tones. Whereas in Yale, we have all these accent marks on top. So these are the way that Yale represents the tones. So let's talk about some pros and cons of each. So for Yale, in general, it just looks a lot better than Yutping. Because Yutping, you have all these numbers everywhere. When Yale, it just has a general nice flow to it that makes you think, oh, this is Cantonese. But on the downside, it has so many accents that even though it's nice to read, it's highly impractical to actually type this, at least using a standard keyboard. On top of that, it's pretty inefficient with characters. So for example, the ch sound, they use the letters ch, but there's no situation where you'd ever use the letter C by itself. So why does the letter C exist when it can only happen in the digraph CH? So how about Yutping? Well, basically it's kind of the opposite. It's efficient with its letters. So for example, you could see as I was talking about the CH, in Yutping it's just a C. As for the cons, the tones look very ugly. And actually, this is one of my major frustrations with the Yutping system. Basically, by using numbers for tones, in my opinion, it's kind of awkward, and it treats Cantonese as a language that's almost like an ancient language where we don't know how people speak, and so we're just assigning different symbols, including numbers, to represent the sounds they make. Kind of like how if you look at the way we represent ancient Egyptian, we just throw a bunch of phonetic symbols together, but it's completely unnatural to read. It's just more of like an academic kind of thing. The other issue is some of the letters chosen in Yutping. So for example, the letter J in Yutping, you could see it on the third line over here. The letter J represents the Y sound in English, the ya, like you. This is very weird to me because this is something that happens in languages like German, but the reality is that most Cantonese speakers don't speak German. If they speak another language, it's going to be English. And for the J sound to represent a completely different sound is again something that seems very academic and kind of out of tune with the common Cantonese speaker. The other issue I have is some weird vowels that just have kind of confused me every time I use Yutping, like the EO and the OE, and I'll try to fix that in Pingji. So here you can see what Pingji looks like in comparison to Yutping and Yale. One of the main things you'll notice is that there are no numbers and there are no accent marks. So what are the goals of Pingji? Well, one of the biggest features is using tones in a way that's natural, because tones are an integral part of the Cantonese language, and I believe they have equal importance as a vowel or a consonant. And while the way Yale does it by using accents is a way of integrating into the word, it's just not practical for typing. And as I mentioned with Yutping, the use of numbers is rather downgrading. So here I'm just making my point that, again, some other romanizations, including Hanyu Pinyin and Vietnamese, they do use accents. But what happens in Pinyin, for example, is many times words are typed without accents because they're just so hard to type. The other issue is that Cantonese has 6 tones. So if you were to give 6 tones for each different letter, then you just have so many accented characters that it just is too much for your keyboard, for example. So Pingji instead uses inspiration from languages like Hmong and Zhuang, which are not very commonly spoken languages, but they do offer innovation by using tone letters. So what are the other major features of Pingji? Well, for starters, there are 25 basic letters, which include all the standard English letters except the letter X. These are all available on any standard keyboard. There are also 3 optional accented letters, which I'll get to much later. Again, they're optional and you don't really need them. They're just more for aesthetic purposes. I try to make the letter phonetic values as typically close to common sounds when possible. So as I was talking before with the y sound, I'll use the letter Y instead of the letter J. Next is a heavy focus on letter efficiency, so using as few letters as possible to make a sound. That's what I was also talking about earlier with the ch sound, just using the letter C instead of the letters CH. And this is important because I'm using tone letters which add another character to each word, and because if you add up all these things together, the words could be very big, so we want to make them as quickly readable as possible. And then finally, I try to have a heavy focus on aesthetics and looking organic. Theoretically, if you have a one-to-one letter-to-sound correspondence, you can have a very efficient language, but the problem is most of these systems will look very ugly. For example, if you did the same thing in English, you would have a very ugly-looking language. Which is why, even though English is notorious for not being one-to-one in terms of its letters and sound, it's still very readable. So as a consequence, this will result in slightly more complex spelling rules, but hopefully they all make sense. Alright, and let's talk about the goals of Pingji in general. So number 1, it's a learning device. As with any romanization, it's a great way to learn the language, especially if you have difficulty reading the Chinese characters, but it's also a great way of learning each Chinese character and how they're pronounced. The number 2 is typing. Theoretically, if you know how to speak Cantonese and you know how Pingji works, you should be able to type anything. Number 3 is more of a consequence of a standardized romanization, and it's a great way to have a standard template for names. So for example, back before Pinyin, we had many different ways of writing Chinese names, but now because of Pinyin, there's a main way to write things. For example, the name Qin Shi Huang, or the famous basketball player Yao Ming. And then this also applies to places. So we used to spell Beijing as Peking, but now that's standardized to Beijing. And then last but not least, it's very useful as a communication tool, basically if you're typing and talking to someone else in Cantonese. So my introduction to Pingji will take up a few videos, and overall the goal of this video series is for people who are at least somewhat familiar with Cantonese at the very least, so both new learners all the way up to native speakers. This is not a video aimed to teach Cantonese, but it's just more to introduce the romanization. And throughout these videos, I'll often make comparisons to Hanyu Pinyin, which is the romanization for Mandarin Chinese. And the reason I do that is because I think Pinyin is a very good system. It checks off all the boxes for what a good romanization system should be. And also in this video, I'll be referring to the IPA, which is the International Phonetic Alphabet. You'll often see a letter with these 2 slashes around them. And when you see that, that's just me referencing a specific sound using the IPA. And for those who aren't familiar, the IPA kind of looks like this. Every unique sound in the world gets a special symbol. And this is for any linguists out there so they know exactly what I'm talking about when I'm assigning a letter to a sound. But if you're not familiar, just ignore it. And so that's it for the introduction. Sorry if it was a little long. In the next few videos, we'll actually dive into how Pingji actually works.